Good day everyone, Æfterra, one angry pagan here. Now, I am slowly catching up with all this shit. What we're going to do here is, once again, we've got yesterday's BBC Politics Live. We're on Wednesday, the 19th of Æfterra, the 11th of January. But this Politics Live is from yesterday, so 10th, 18th of Æfterra. Just wanted to add, once again, if you do watch this, warning, I tend to lose my shit with the Tories on stuff like this, so if you don't like swearing stuff and you don't like angry pagans, don't watch me. But if you do, please like, subscribe, and please comment. I love comments. I like debate. I like to talk. I like to communicate. And please let me know on the name Æfterra or One Angry Pagan or both. Let me know. Yeah. Here we go. Politics Live from yesterday.
Joining me today, the Conservative MP Siobhan Bailey, the SNPs Kirsten Oswald, Sonia Soda from The Observer and Zoe Strimple from The Sunday Telegraph. Today,
anyone with symptoms of a respiratory infection, a cold, flu or COVID, should try to stay at home, and if you do need to leave home, wear a face covering.
Nicola Sturgeon says face masks can help ease pressure on the NHS. Law says key public services will have to provide a minimum service even when they're on strike.
I've looked at the evidence from elsewhere in the world, in Europe and globally, and I can see that minimum safety levels work in many, many other modern European countries, and they're effectively...
Yeah, because they've got regulations.
That a low-paid health assistant, a nurse, a paramedic would lose their job for pursuing their right to take industrial action.
The gender recognition reform.
Not only that, but this government, this Tory government's been going, oh, we've got to do things differently. It's all rich. Rishi Sunak coming out today on the 19th of Æfterra, the 11th. On PMQs, and I've got Starmer, or closer alignment. But the Tories have been saying they want to separate from Europe. That's what this whole EU bill bullshit is about, isn't it? Really hypocritical from the Conservative government.
Scotland bill is passed.
The next
Group passed a bill making it easier for people in Scotland to legally change their gender, but UK ministers may block it. Liz Truss said relaxing childcare regulations would boost the economy, but has Rishi Sunak scrapped the plans? You heard Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister there in the headlines, advising people to wear a mask if they have a cold or flu symptoms. It was at a press conference. Let's listen to a little bit more of what she had to say.
If you do need to leave home, wear a face covering, which fits well. More generally, we continue to advise that those over the age of 12 should wear face coverings when on public transport or in...
I was using this before the pandemic. Yeah? It's 3-layered. 3 layers of it. So I'm not gonna have... Oh, hang on. Yeah, okay. So I'm not gonna have people going, oh, it's not good enough. It doesn't have to be, perfect, but if it mitigates the spread of infectious viruses and bacterium, then I'm all for it.
Public indoor spaces. That includes hospitals, GP surgeries and other healthcare facilities. By protecting our own health in these ways, we also do help to protect the NHS.
Nicola Sturgeon said it was the most challenging winter for the Scottish NHS. So should we go back to wearing face masks to protect the health service, Siobhan?
I think two things. Face masks should be personal choice. I know the UK Health Security Agency is suggesting.
It's only advice. It doesn't mean match. It's just advising that if you go out, use a face mask. It wasn't. I didn't gather that that was mandatory.
That they might be useful, but it absolutely should come down to individuals. And if they are deciding to wear a face mask, then it should be off the back of research and deciding what type of material. But
and what would you do?
Like. So I personally wouldn't.
I'm sorry, but covering your mouth does stop it. That does mitigate these problems. I've seen loads of scientific evidence when it comes to face masks, and as someone who goes by science and has read the majority of the scientific journals throughout the pandemic when it concerns this kind of thing, and watched university lectures, not just newspaper bullshit, you'll know that face masks in fact do work. It's just you don't treat them like it's a fucking sealant. Like all of a sudden nothing can get through or nothing can get out. It just helps to prevent it. It's the same with the vaccines. People treat the vaccines as if it was, it's just some great absolute, but it isn't. It just mitigates the problem.
Wear a face mask. If it is required of me or it's going to make other people feel more comfortable, then I will think about it. But I think...
Well, you'll think about it, will you? Self-important bitch.
The suggestion constantly about masks being the thing to protect the NHS is for the birds. I mean...
Fuck you. When they feel in Southeast Asia, when they feel like things are about to go to shit when it comes to, infectious diseases, I've seen the evidence of them using face masks, not just for really serious ones, but if this sort of thing gets out, that's the first thing they do, and it cuts it out. They don't have as big of a problem. I wonder why.
We shut down parts of the country to protect the NHS. We wore masks in the pandemic.
Yeah, right. Again, it's absolutism. This is a problem. This absolutist thinking. It was each of these things together that helped to mitigate the problems. To mitigate the danger. Not get rid of it. Not cure it. But mitigate it, so it doesn't cause so much damage.
The masks were not the thing that's going to save. And actually, what's going to help the NHS is that some of the things that the Secretary of State were announcing yesterday.
All right. Well, sticking with the idea of masks, Kirsten, what do you say to Siobhan, who says it's for the birds, to suggest that wearing a face mask, voluntary or otherwise, to protect the NHS?
I think that's wrong. That's not what Nicola Sturgeon said. That's one of a number of things that will help us to...
Just as I was saying, it's non-absolutism. It's a non-absolutist way of doing things. Why? Because non-absolutist thinking is realistic.
Protect the NHS.
So she's advising people with a respiratory infection, it would be better to wear a face mask because there are pressures,
that's
unprecedented
right.
pressures
But
on
of
the
course,
NHS.
there are other things that we're doing as well to try and mitigate against this. The vaccination programme is obviously vitally important. It's really important that people use services in the appropriate way. And one of the other things that we can do, and I think it's a good common sense piece of advice from Nicola Sturgeon, is in appropriate circumstances, you might want to be wearing a face mask. I'm certainly going to take on board her advice and do that in the appropriate circumstances. If it is going to if it's going to do...
It doesn't sound like this is mandatory. So once again, the Tory fucking moron jumping onto an absolute that isn't there.
the job of making things potentially a little bit less difficult, then
So
it's
you do see the
absolutely no
link
skin off my nose to wear a face covering if I'm going into the doctor's surgery, or if I had symptoms, I would certainly be wearing a face covering. I think that's a personally responsible thing. But Siobhan also said that, that she wasn't going to do that. And nobody, you wouldn't do it unless somebody made you. Nobody's suggesting that somebody's going to make you go and do it. But there is I think, a personal responsibility there, that in the appropriate circumstances, that is something that we should reasonably consider.
I think
everything's changed since COVID came along, and we probably need to change our outlook a little bit.
The difference is it's that personal choice and assessing circumstances rather than it being a government diktat or the state.
It's not a government
advice from up
diktat.
high. I think that's what we've learned.
But this isn't a government diktat. She's putting labels on it that aren't real or aren't applicable. This isn't a diktat, this is advice.
I think it's the job of the state to give advice in these circumstances. I think that was a responsible thing for Nicola Sturgeon to do. All health services are suffering from winter pressures, whether it be COVID or the flu or respiratory viruses. And
I wonder if the Tories know what the word diktat actually fucking means, because they like to dictate a hell of a lot.
If we can do something to mitigate that, then that's a sensible thing for us to think about.
I mean, the question is around should we wear face masks to protect the NHS, even if it is one of a number of measures being taken?
I mean, I sort of think what Nicola Sturgeon said is basic common sense. I think if you've got a bad cold or a cough, I think it's kind of a common courtesy, actually, if you're going out and about, to maybe put a mask on. I think one of the upshots of the pandemic, there weren't very many silver linings, but one of them is that we've got a better sense of public health around respiratory conditions. And actually, I mean, I don't think it's something that's going to get taken up en masse. I think probably people without symptoms, we're not going to see many people without symptoms not putting a mask on. But, I was one of the people who had a bug over the Christmas break. Lots of people did. There's some really nasty cold bugs and viruses going around at the moment. It's certainly something I'd do if I was going on public transport. I mean, I think Nicola Sturgeon's right. Try and stay at home if you're ill. And again, I think that's something we're getting better at as a result of the pandemic. But it's common courtesy, isn't it? You don't want to be coughing and spluttering all over people when you're not feeling well.
Pre the pandemic, of course, we didn't get this sort of advice, did we?
No, we didn't. But I think the pandemic has obviously changed everything. But I think the nub of this issue is the sort of slippery slope idea, which is that if we are sort of telling people they have to do this to preserve the NHS, like
again, this woman is now trying to treat it as no one said you have to. Slippery slope.
Where does that end? I mean, we all know that the NHS has serious existential problems that it's currently facing. So to me, the issue is, why stop with, advising people to do this? Is it, this is also in the sort of obesity thing. Don't eat too much junk food because of the NHS. Don't do this because of the NHS. And you end up having a society that's paying taxes for a dysfunctional health system while also being begged or asked by the government to live their lives in certain ways to preserve that health system. In terms of the masks themselves, I mean, I think the problem was that there was crap messaging around masks in the first place. Britain was one of the worst countries.
So what, do you think we should move to an American system? And I'm telling you, that would be fucking worse.
In the West, actually, with its mask etiquette, you'd go on the tube in the height of the pandemic and half the people wouldn't be bothering. So I think the message about why masks are important never really got through here.
I don't think that was the same in Scotland, if you don't mind me interjecting.
And I've got to say, down here in the southwest, more often than not, people were wearing the masks. Yeah, there were some dickheads that weren't. Well, some people with exceptions, but more often than not, the general rule was that people were wearing masks on public transport. That was the general rule, down this way. So again, you've got someone applying an example that they've seen to the rest of the country when it's not applicable, when it's not realistic. An absolute. This absolutism needs to stop.
that we did have pretty good adherence to wearing masks at that really, pinch point time when things were so difficult. And, I wonder, what the reason for that is. I wonder if maybe some of that was about messaging. I think the messaging was a bit different in Scotland during the height of the pandemic. But for me, what you're saying about, that the government shouldn't be giving us health and wellbeing advice, I reckon that they probably should. I think that's a responsible
fine,
thing.
but I think in a sense we're all agreeing, because everyone can decide. I'm seeing people on the tube now all the time wearing masks. It's completely fine to wear a mask, but I think people are a bit unclear in England anyway about why you would wear a mask. So the idea of self-protection is a good reason to wear a mask, but I think the problem is the government advising you to wear a mask because it's good for you, or the government advising you to wear a mask because it's good for the NHS, are two different things.
I think one of the things I really want...
No, it's good for both. This is absolutism. Do you see what I mean? It's got to be one or the other. There's no scale. There's no graduation through it. There's no balance. It's just one thing or the other. Despite the fact that's not realist. That's not the realistic. That's not the realism. That's not the facts. She's spouting her own opinion as if it's fact, when it isn't. Look, if I get something wrong, I expect you guys to correct me, okay? But Trisha's software issues. For me, I have to make it so that if I say something, if it's my opinion, then I say it's my opinion. However, if I don't do that, then what I've said can be backed up by facts. All I'm doing is reiterating the facts, not my opinions on it. More often than not, what I'm shouting back at people are facts. So they're arguing, not with my opinion, not with my view of the facts, but the facts in of themselves. It's fucking ridiculous. There are a few absolutes. Facts. Once a fact has happened, it's happened. There are a couple of exceptions. But once a fact has happened, it's happened. I said this. I'm saying these words. I can't unsay them. Quite literally impossible. It's one of the few absolutes. But this is not an absolute. These are not absolutes. This is what this woman perceives as absolutes. But this is, again, what I'm trying to say. A big problem with today's mindset, with today's society's mindset, is that it's all absolutes. They want one thing or the other. One thing or the other. One thing or the other. We need to move past that bullshit. Because it's not realistic. It's not factual. It has no relation to actual life.
To avoid, and where I will go bananas, is any suggestion that we should have children.
And don't give me the bullshit of life is how you perceive it. Yeah, everyone perceives life differently, but a fact is still a fact. It still happened. Whether you perceive it differently is meaningless. Especially if you're arguing that the fact never happened in the first place. It's stupid.
Back wearing masks in schools, there's a real fear that we get back to those types of
Is there a real fear? Are people worried about that?
I think there is. We've had long periods of time where there was sort of heavy-handed advice coming from government, for good reasons often. But what we've got to be is adults can make their own minds up, and like Sonia said, if you're feeling that unwell, not going out is the right approach. But let us make our minds up. We don't need politicians to stand up.
Well, just briefly before we move.
It's not advice. It's the job of government to give advice. But of course, this is one of the Tories that hasn't listened to Ken fucking Clark yet about fucking stopping the bullshit ideology of small state conservatism. Ken fucking Clark is now saying that's bullshit.
Move on. Kirsten, do you think this will become
And yes, I'm not exactly a fan of Ken Clark either. He's a fucking Tory. But if that man is saying that Tories now need to get around their minds that small state conservatism is not sustainable. It's not realistic. It's complete bullshit.
Annual message from Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister. When the NHS is under pressure, please wear a mask because it might help.
Do you know, I think it's difficult to say because the world has moved on since the COVID pandemic hit us up. We weren't prepared for this in so many ways, were we mentally? Never mind in terms of all the practicalities. And so I think that we're kind of playing catch up, all of us, in our own minds about how we need to conduct ourselves, how we need to behave. So I think it'll come down to whether COVID remains such an issue. And it is an issue. COVID hasn't gone away. So if we can do something to keep ourselves safe and minimise the pressure on the NHS, then it strikes me that that's a sensible thing to do.
Everybody knows that strikes are happening at the moment, and there are more in the pipeline, possibly by ambulance workers, driving examiners and bus drivers. Primary school teachers are taking strike action for the next 2 days in Scotland, and next week there are more strikes in the diary for nurses. Let's have a look at this headline in The Guardian. Ministers to unveil anti-strike laws as disputes continue to paralyse UK.
It's entirely hypocritical for the government to bring these out when the nurses invite them in for talks. The reason why the government do it is because it's going to be about money, and the government doesn't want to pay out the cash. It says it can't, but that's a pile of shite.
Okay, we talked about this minimum service legislation, the idea about public sector services able to maintain a minimum service level during strike action. Should the government press ahead with this?
The government can the staff, they can barely keep minimum levels going as it is.
I think so. I mean, I haven't seen the legislation yet. I'm here.
Think about it. It's a thought exercise. If you're as it is, without the strikes, if your health service is running to a point where it can't work, even, it struggles to even get minimum service, what then is the point in bringing minimum service laws? What is the actual point?
But what we want to achieve is that minimum level of safety and something.
We can barely get that as it is.
Actually, that the nurses made proposals about and stuck to in terms of their striking, but actually make sure that it goes across the board. I mean, these proposals are setting the scene that is already happening in Spain, France, Germany. What we're also suggesting is that.
What about this whole? We're going to separate ourselves from Europe. We're going to do this differently from Europe. I don't disagree. We should, take line from Europe. Not on this. We should take line from Europe. It's funny how they'll take a line from the EU countries when it comes to stuff they like. But when it's laws they don't like, they're like, oh no, the EU's all terrible.
That effectively, the discussions with the unions aim to reach an agreement about minimal safety standards. But if that agreement cannot be reached, which what happened with the ambulance unions, that there will be a backstop of statutory minimum cover.
The reason it couldn't be reached is because the government refused to actually negotiate. This is parroting bullshit here.
What's wrong with it, Kirsten?
do you know, the whole approach of the UK government to employment relations and the way that they've dealt with these conversations about pay and about strikes, I think it's
but on the minimum service level, do you have
wrong-headed.
Right, and I understand that completely. But what's your sort of principal objection to the idea of having a minimum service? I mean, perhaps constituents in Scotland would like to see that when it comes to nurses or ambulance drivers on strike.
No one wants to see strikes, and that includes the people who are taking this action at the moment. But you know, that has to always be underpinned by a properly respectful dialogue. That's definitely not happened with the UK government. It has to also be underpinned by people's rights to withdraw their labour. And again, nobody wants to see that happening. I certainly don't want to see that happening. But people's fundamental rights are at stake here. So the way to deal with this is not by this, I think, you know, really perplexing and damaging way of dealing with workers and with employment. The way to deal with this is to make sure that proper dialogue happens, that proper discussion happens. That will result in us having appropriately staffed services, and that will result in people feeling and being respected at their work. And all of that's missing in the UK government's approach at the moment. Their approach to employment is
minimum safety and service.
Disappointing.
Minimum safety and service is not going to prevent people striking. It's also not going to prevent.
When the public services are only just able to run anyway, which is basically minimum service, how do you expect to keep minimum service running when they're going on strike? Therefore, this would stop them striking. This is anti-strike laws. This is anti-democratic.
Discussions
That's fucking why.
Agreements where there are disputes. What we're trying to achieve, you know, we talk about workers. There's millions and millions of private sector workers that are not able to strike, that have been hugely disrupted and
I wonder why they're not able to strike.
affected by the strikes that have been happening in this country. And equally, some of the pressures on places like our health services and the ambulance, they haven't been helped by the strike. And what we're trying to do is create a balance. So what is the balance that helps the...
It's the health services going on fucking strike. You dumbass blonde bitch. I don't like to get sexist, but this fucking Tory MP is a blonde bitch who doesn't have a clue what she's talking about. You lambaste me in the comments all you like. This fucking twat doesn't know what she's fucking talking about. I'll just come out with some bullshit as if it's the facts. Once again, some idiot treating opinion as if it's fact when it isn't. She doesn't have a fucking clue. It's the health services going on strike because you haven't helped them. There's no point going on strikes don't help the health services either. Like dumb little blonde bitch you are. Because you haven't helped the health services in the fucking first place. Hypocritical twats. Contradictory fucking Tory.
country keep going and get our productivity going and keeps look at workers across all sectors.
Is it going to undermine people's right to strike?
Yes!
Yeah, I think it will. And I think we've got to look at this legislation and what it's for and whether it's actually needed. So we saw nurses, for example, they reached agreement. We saw, for example, with the ambulance worker strike, there were picket lines where there weren't any ambulance workers because they'd all been called out.
I have to apologise. Right? I didn't mean to go so overboard. I'm not sexist. I really am not. I mean, if it was a bloke, if it was Jacob Rees-Mogg, I would have been just as insulting. I don't give a fuck. It's a Tory. I'm going to be insulting. Because they are insulting us by being in fucking government. And making our lives harder.
out to critical calls. This idea that paramedics and nurses are not going to offer life-saving care during a strike, I think that's something the government's looking to shore up, but it doesn't stack up when you look at what happened.
Exactly.
I think actually the nursing union has pushed back with the government with a really effective response, which is one of the reasons we're striking is because this service isn't safe. Nursing isn't safe because we don't have enough nurses. Paramedics are striking and they're saying...
So there's no fucking point. I'm not arguing with Sonia here. I'm arguing with the fucking Tory cunt. There's no fucking point coming out with these fucking anti-strike laws, these minimum service legislation, when we can barely, minimum service is what we can barely do as it is. The logic is stupid.
The ambulance service isn't safe because outside of strike days, if you've got a life-threatening condition, sometimes you have to wait.
If I was on there, I'd be going, you Tories need to leave. You need to call a general election so that someone can actually take over and deal with the situation, because you cunts refuse to. I really would like to be face on face with a Tory right now. I really would. I would tear them to fucking shreds. And every time they come up with a fact, I'll go on my phone, I'll go on the internet, and I'll find the evidence to prove them wrong. Because almost every single time a Tory comes out with something, it's a fucking lie that can be evidence to prove that they are lying. It's not difficult to prove to catch a Tory in a lie these days. It really isn't.
Too long for an ambulance. They're saying, if you agree in minimum service levels, why don't we have statutory minimum service levels year round that the government is obliged to meet? And I think that's something that the government really doesn't have a response to. The reason we've got these strikes is because nurse pay has fallen in real terms by 8% over the last decade. That is leading to a staffing crisis, creating unsafe care in the NHS. It's not acceptable.
I mean, is it appropriate response from the government to the situation?
Well, I mean, I think the situation is actually a bit of that's exactly the problem. I think there's quite a difference between the different strikes going on. I think when it comes to the rail unions, I think it's interesting. That's not getting, it's unclear what the minimum service means in terms of the rail. And I think
minimum safety.
Minimum safety, yeah.
Let me give you some evidence from my dad. There about barely anyone on the windows at the moment. They're struggling to keep people on the windows at the moment. A ticket office. They're struggling to hold that. That's minimum service. People don't understand that the private companies in the government have... Hang on. Phone interruptions.
I mean, I think the whole rail strike situation is extremely unsympathetic, actually, and I think it comes across as greedy, and people are.
It's bullshit. And not only that, but again, talking to my dad, who's been on the picket lines, he's not had that. He's had still had a fair amount of support. But this fucking greed bullshit, I'm going to pull complete umbrage with. It's absolute bullshit. I'm fed up of people coming onto the media speaking down about the rail workers, despite the fact that they were one of the vital services that kept on running during the pandemic, during the first year, when everyone else was locked down. The amount of times my dad had to be there day after day, almost by himself, and most of the time, it was just refunds. So where is all the money? Considering all the refunds, where is all the fucking money? Because the workers haven't been taking it. That's why they're on the fucking strike. Majority of what people working in the railway aren't on this kind of money. Again, it's just attributing drivers' wages to people who don't work on the fucking trains. It's ridiculous. Not only that, but the train companies are trying to make our railways more dangerous. That's one of the other main reasons they're striking. Complete ignorance here.
Are not sympathetic to very well paid people already who are worried
Not
about being phased out because of technology, which is understandable, but that's what's going on there. With the nurses and the paramedics and the ambulance drivers, people really understand that. And after COVID, when they've been through hell, and there's a sense that they are really underpaid, and these are fundamental. But the problem is the government's approach is sort of twiddling little bits of legislation constantly, but never actually...
You don't understand the situation either. You're trying to treat railway strikers as if they're fucking greedy. How fucking dare you? Pretentious cow.
Dealing with the underlying issue. So you can twiddle and twiddle and twiddle and make little new bits of things that make it harder for people to protest or harder for people to strike. And fine, those things are inconvenient to the country, but what about the underlying problem that the NHS just basically completely doesn't work anymore? I mean, this sort of basic minimum safety is not going to help with overhauling the fundamentals.
I was on my feet yesterday challenging the Health Secretary to say that the additional money, more billions of pounds going into the health service will reach frontline workers. And you're absolutely right. There is so many things that need to be supported. I mean, I'm doing campaigns for midwives. Midwives are crying out about safety.
And when your voting record is looked at, let's have a look to see what, when it comes to wage rises for these people. I wonder what the support looks. I wonder what your voting record looks like.
But what we're talking about here is, ultimately looking across the country, the impact of the
voting down for a proper wage rises over the years before the pandemic, refusing actual pay rises, voting against actual pay rises for the public sector workers that she's apparently campaigning for. She's a lying bitch.
These strikes, there are a lot of people that are expecting the government to make
lying two-faced bitch
changes to make sure that the country keeps moving.
And no, I'm not going to apologise for calling this cunt a bitch or a cunt. I don't fucking care. She obviously fucking doesn't. If she did, she wouldn't be fucking continuing to lie and treat these lies as if they are facts.
And there is nothing in this proposed legislation that will prevent the striking.
If the services are running at minimum service anyway, because that's all they can achieve, and then people are going on strike, you're forcing them not to then go back to the work to achieve minimum service. We'll take these workers, these strivers, who are also strikers, away from striking. So once again, you don't know what you're talking about, you lying Tory bitch.
And it's not, I've heard the Labour Party trying to suggest that it means we're going to imprison all, nurses.
Well, people might lose their jobs. Isn't that a logical conclusion if employers might be able to actually take action against unions if they don't keep to a minimum service?
It will become part of a contractual arrangement.
Right.
So you will know that you might not be able to strike for the entire week, but you might do a day and then it'll be on a rota basis.
I mean, wouldn't NHS...
Right. I can't remember his first name. Damn. Tarry MP, Labour MP, right? He pointed this out on LBC last night. The reason why this is complete bullshit is because when you have strikes that last for, a period of day, the set period of days, like we've already got, afterwards, it all starts running again. Whereas this makes it so that it's a lot more drawn out. So it doesn't fucking help. Therefore, and i.e., this bitch doesn't know what the fuck she's talking about. And if it was a bloke, I'd have called him a fucking twat. Or a bellend. Or a knob. Or also a cunt. So don't be getting on at me about fucking sexism.
Patients in Scotland
I'm not
appreciate
sexist.
that.
I think NHS patients in Scotland probably appreciate the fact that in Scotland...
Before I get to, one doth protest too much. No, I've had people go, no, I'm not sexist. I'm insulting to people who deserve to be insulted. Quite simple. To me, it doesn't matter what your skin is, what your religion is, what your ideology is. If you're being stupid, I will insult you. If you're being insulting to me, to mine, to the rest of us, knowingly, lying to the public, being insulting, I will call you a cunt. If you're female, I'll call you a bitch. If you're male, I'll call you a knob or a bellend. This isn't sexism. This is swearing.
We've not had NHS strikes. There is that.
But you have had other strikes on critical services.
Do you know, and I think that people appreciate that this is something that is not done lightly by any worker.
But you've got teachers on strike. You've got teachers on strike for the next 2 days, and secondary school teachers going on strike.
Absolutely.
And you'll get the government going, oh, these are devolved matters. But you are the ones who sort the budget out.
You know, and again, the dialogue continues with that group of workers. Yeah. You know, they also have had a really hard
parents
time.
Appreciate perhaps minimum service from teachers while people go out on strike.
I'm sure that the teachers do a significant service, but it is important for us to have a balanced approach to this. And the approach that Siobhan and her colleagues are taking is very far from that. It's really detrimental to all of our services, whether it's health, whether it's education, or even, you know, you spoke about the rail workers. It's really detrimental to all of these services if we cannot have a sensible dialogue, if we can't have people's ability to work in a constructive way with their employers, with government. That's really damaging. What I think should happen actually is that the UK government should get a grip of this, that they should have proper conversations, and while they're about it, they should devolve employment law to Scotland so that if they can't deal with this properly, as evidently they can't, then we can have a much more constructive approach to dealing with fair work in Scotland.
I mean, is this legislation really the answer, Siobhan, to resolving the strikes? I hear what you say about keeping the country moving, but is it actually a resolution? It's not going to come on board anyway for this sort of set of strikes. So I mean, is it answering the wrong question?
I think it's one of a range of things that have been happening, and we know particularly with the health service.
Now you're being non-absolutist.
The health service, health and social care, an absolute priority. We've seen more money going in, 3.3 billion for the next couple of years.
Now you see that there are non-absolutes.
Additional priorities.
Very convenient.
Isn't it?
But on pay, the independent body and the independent review body, the government is having discussions this week. They're talking about transparency on the information going to the independent review body. So the legislation on the minimum service levels is just one part. But I do think that when we look at the disruption to the country that everybody has faced in the recent months, that people are expecting legislators to come up with some new solutions, and this is one of them.
Grant Shapps, the business secretary, is up in the House, I think, in the next 45 minutes talking about this. I just want to show you this headline in BBC News: energy bill support for firms to be reduced from April. It's being reduced quite significantly by as much as 2/3. You can find more details about it on the BBC website. And for those of you who, of course, were watching Politics Live yesterday, you will know we discussed this at length, the impact on business with the owner of a hair salon in Peterborough and her experiences of dealing with rising energy costs. You can catch up with that discussion on the iPlayer. Let's move on and look at this headline in The Times. Westminster poised to intervene over gender bill assent. Now, there were mixed reactions. You heard them there in Holyrood when the Scottish Government passed a law to make it easier for people to legally change their gender in Scotland. The UK Government has said it opposes the changes and may move to block it. Let's talk to our...
So, how is this an equal partnership of nations? This is supposed to be a devolved power. Scotland voted to do this in their own country. It's not to be a UK-wide thing, but for Scotland alone. This, again, is England asserting its authority over Alba because it thinks it owns it. Well, I'm sorry, England. We don't own Alba at all.
LGBT and identity correspondent Lauren Moss. Hello to you, Lauren. Tell us, what is the Scottish Government's plan?
Hi, well, this is essentially a bill that will make it quicker and easier for somebody to change their legal sex. That's the sex on their birth certificate. Without changing legal sex, people can already change their passport with certain documents. They can change their driver's license, the way they identify socially, certain services that they access, or facilities like toilets, for example. This doesn't intersect with that. But what it does do, it will essentially allow somebody to get married or have a civil partnership in the gender that they identify as. It will change their sex for tax purposes and on their birth certificate as well. So what the bill in Scotland will do is change the law as it stands at the minute of the application of this. It will lower the age from 18 to 16. It will also remove the need for a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, which is the sense of unease a person feels if their gender identity does not match their biological sex. And it will also remove the wait time of 2 years that somebody would have to provide evidence that they've lived in what's called their acquired gender for, from 2 years to 3 months, with a 3-month reflection period afterwards. And to give you an idea of the numbers of how many people this could apply to, there are 30 gender recognition certificates issued in Scotland roughly every year now, and Scottish ministers predict this could have a tenfold rise from around 250 to 300 a year, which is something similar that's been seen in the Republic of Ireland, which introduced a similar sort of self-ID system and process back in 2015.
So what's the UK's government response been to this, except, and on top of what I've already said, which is to block it in some way?
Well, just because the bill was voted for before Christmas, it certainly doesn't mean that's the end of it by any stretch of the imagination, like what you were just saying then. It's about a month or 3 weeks now before it will then go to receive royal assent. And within minutes of this bill being voted for, Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Jack, released a strongly worded statement saying the UK government had concerns about it, which we already knew, and were considering a number of issues around how it could intersect with the Equality Act, which the Scottish government doesn't have the power to pass any law which could interfere with the law around equalities. And one of the options they said they are considering is something called a Section 35 order under the Scotland Act. And what this effectively does would block this bill being passed or going for royal assent on the grounds that it would interfere with that law I just mentioned around equalities, which Scotland doesn't have the power to do. Now, this order has never been put forward before, so it would be quite unprecedented if it did. If this,
you know why all this is happening, don't you? It's not just around it's not just around the particular issue, because of what the SNP are trying to do. I'm pretty sure most legislation that the SNP are going to try and put through that may possibly be in some way controversial, the Tories are going to be, oh no. I mean, my God. When the SNP came up with that stuff, with the policy for free tampons and such, yeah, the Tories spoke out against that, saying it was a waste of money. I had my mum saying, "I wish it was they had that down here." It's absolutely disgusting.
UK government did do that, it's highly likely that Scottish government would then move for a judicial review, and we'd see all of this playing out in the courts. And in the background of ongoing discussions around independence, you might imagine that might be something that Westminster would want to avoid. There is another route as well, though, which could be to amend or sort of update the Gender Recognition Act for the rest of the UK, which would see that certificates issued in Scotland not being accepted or recognised in the rest of the UK. And it's that the Minister for Women and Equalities, Kemi Badenoch, seemed to sort of indicate is something that's being considered yesterday. In a written ministerial statement, she said that the UK is going to update the list of countries that it accepts gender recognition certificates from. Now, at the minute, there are about 40 countries and overseas countries and territories where certificates are accepted in the UK without any additional paperwork. 11 or so of those have a self-ID process, like Denmark and Malta and Belgium, and the list hasn't been updated in over 10 years. And Kemi Badenoch said they're now looking at this list because some of these countries don't have what she called robust processes in place.
Right.
And they may have to meet additional requirements if those countries are then removed.
Okay.
Scotland obviously isn't an overseas country, so we don't know how that will affect Scotland, but it's certainly laying the groundwork, I think, for continued opposition. And we'll find out more about this in the
Just
coming
so they
weeks,
could be in opposition
Lauren
to the
Moss,
SNP.
thank you very much. We're joined now by Robin White, a barrister and author who has written a book about transgender law. Robin, welcome to the programme. Why do you support these changes in Scotland?
Good afternoon. Well, I'm trans myself, and I were I gay, I don't have to put myself in front of a panel to decide who's gay enough to achieve the legal protections that those of different sexual orientation achieve. And why should I and other trans people not be believed in who we say we are? Why is that not good enough?
I mean, you changed your gender a long time ago, I understand, but you didn't go through a gender recognition certification process. So what was your personal experience of being recognised in your current gender?
Very easy. As your correspondent has said, I can get a changed passport, I can have a changed driving licence.
Yes.
I practice professionally under a changed name and set of pronouns. But, and she mentioned a number of matters where that change doesn't occur unless one has a GRC. Were I to die, for example, then I'm recorded as male on my death certificate. And that's a horrendous circumstance for someone, perhaps the partner of a trans person who has to deal with that. So there are a number of areas in which having a changed birth certificate is very important to trans people.
I mean, what's the sort of basis, if you like? People might say, why reduce the time of living in your acquired gender from 2 years to 3 months? I mean, it sounds quite arbitrary. I mean, why not scrap it altogether? Why not propose not having it at all?
Well, and indeed that was part of the discussion in Scotland. I had, frankly, fought against my trans nature for 30 years until the time when I finally transitioned. So I was in no doubt as to who I was.
Right.
It was the societal pressures, perhaps, that held me back for those many years.
But then do you understand why having a substantial period of time then would be wise?
Well, I think the evidence is that trans people know who they are. And
Same with gay people. It's not like a religious journey. It's taken me many years to find my path. When it comes to my pagan path, this is not like religion. It's not like an ideology.
Suspect that I support the compromise period of a short period of months because it's a very important change in someone's life, very significant change that someone needs to make, and it's not a change that should be entered into lightly. And the Scottish arrangements obviously involve a statutory declaration, which is a very significant.
It's just complete bullshit. So I'm gonna have to pause again.